Good evening, everyone. You're all very welcome. My name's Eve Patton, and I'm director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, which is this building. And as I think many of you will know, this is Trinity's Arts and Humanities Research Institute. And every year, the Trinity Long Room Hub hosts the Annual Humanities Horizons Lecture. We've had a very distinguished lineage of speakers in the past. And this evening, another stellar figure joins us. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Lonnie Bunch, who is Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, that extraordinary complex of museums, of educational centers, and research institutes in Washington. Lonnie, and I have checked, I'm allowed to call him Lonnie, Lonnie took up his current position in 2019, but it was many years before that. I think back at the millennium when he was still working as director of the Chicago Historical Society, that he began the work, thank you, Barbara, that he began the work that would eventually lead to the establishment of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Over the last few days, I've been reading his own account of how that vision became a reality in his wonderful book, A Fool's Errand. And Lonnie, I have to confess, I did not expect this book to open with a quotation from Grateful Dead, but there it is. How cool is that? But if you read, and I hope you will read A Fool's Errand, you'll be struck not only by the resilience with which he weathered the storms of three successive and very different presidential administrations, through Bush, through Obama, and of course through Trump, but also by how much he has been shaped in regard to his vision by a grassroots belief, a commitment to history as, and here I'm quoting the words that he himself quotes from an elderly gentleman that he met when he visited a former plantation, a commitment and a belief in history as, and I quote, not what we want to remember, but what we need to remember. Well, I think very much that agenda has also shaped the work of my colleague here in Trinity, Professor Jane Allmeyer, who is Erasmus Smith's Professor of Modern History. Jane's recent book, which I know many of you will know, Making Empire, has documented at a very granular level the ironies of Ireland's position, that inside-outside position in history of imperial land grab, colonial administration, and of course, slavery itself. So I think she is the ideal person this evening to be in conversation with Lonnie Bunch for this fireside chat, as we're calling it. Please excuse that for health and safety reasons, we have no actual fire. So we're going to listen to the conversation, and afterwards we'll be very pleased to have questions, responses, comments from all of you. But for now, I would ask you all just to double check that your phones are on silent, and then to join with me in welcoming Jane Allmeyer and Secretary Lonnie Bunch.
Good evening, everybody. It's so fabulous to see the hub so packed, and I can understand why. Eve, thank you for that lovely introduction. Lonnie Bunch is one of my heroes. I want to be like Lonnie when I grow up. I mean, you couldn't have a more inspiring person. And I don't want to embarrass him because he's one of the most humble people I've met as well. But spending some time with Lonnie this afternoon and with Maria and Sarah and Brittany has been an absolute pleasure. And this afternoon wouldn't have been possible though without two people. And I just want to mention Mary Pat Kelly and Kieran Madden, because they have been working very hard to make it happen. So it's lovely to welcome you to Dublin, Secretary Bunch. I'll call you Lonnie if I may as well. And really, I suppose it's to just talk a little bit about your current role. Let's start with the Smithsonian museums, and I guess many people have visited them. They are the most incredible network, obviously free to visitors, or they were last time I went. I hope they still are free. But it really is an experience to visit, and what a role to actually be the boss there. So So tell us a little bit about your current role, if you wouldn't mind, and also those challenges that you face, as well as the opportunities that you have.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for inviting me. I talked to my mother, who's 97 years old today, and I told her, you don't remember, but I applied for a fellowship to Trinity and didn't get it. So thank you so much for finally letting me show up. I appreciate that. But I think that despite not getting the fellowship, my career's been okay. I think, one of the joys of being the secretary of the Smithsonian is that you realize that the Smithsonian is really the glue that helps hold a nation together. It's a place that uses art, history, culture, and science to help people find understanding, find clarity, and maybe find a little hope. And I think for me, I was very lucky. I'm the first secretary of the Smithsonian that rose through the ranks since the 1920s. So it really gives me a different perspective than traditional secretaries. So I understand what it's like to do the work of a curator. I understand what it's like to sort of fight to make sure the education shapes the educational system. And I understand what it's like to deal with Congress. So that in essence, what is the great joy is really recognizing that there are 7,000 public servants who all they want to do is make America better. All they want to do is give people a reservoir that they can dip into to live their lives. That's the greatest part of being at the Smithsonian. And the other part is obviously you learn something every day that you don't know. I mean, I'm a good 19th century historian, and last week I was talking about pandas. So you find yourself torn to do things that you really weren't trained to do, but it's been great fun. And I guess the challenge of the Smithsonian is really the challenge that we see today in America. And that is the challenge of making sure that you can do the scholarly work, that you can explore the history, culture, and science that you want, and make sure people understand two things. Understand the importance of scholarship and expertise, and understand the importance of making that expertise accessible. And so the Smithsonian's notion from its very beginning of working for the increase and diffusion of knowledge is really the model that we still have. Let us go forth and serve. That's what the Smithsonian tries to do.
And does so amazingly. You began your career, though, as a historian. What took you then from history into the world of museums? Was it that desire to serve? Because you're obviously a hugely distinguished academic as well, Lonnie.
Well, I would like to say that it was a conscious decision, but the reality was I was finishing up graduate school and I was broke. I was living on a teaching assistant salary of $309 a month in Washington, D.C., and I was bemoaning my future. And there was a returning graduate student. She was so old, she was probably 40. And she said to me that her husband worked at the Smithsonian. I should go talk to her. And I remember thinking so clearly, who the hell works at the Smithsonian? It's where you take dates because it's free. And that was my notion of the Smithsonian. So I go down to meet the secretary of the Smithsonian. I was so dumb. I thought it was a clerical person I was meeting. I didn't realize it was the head of the whole institution. So I've got a big afro, I'm in jeans, I'm in an Army officer's jacket. So I'm not getting a job. So I'm comfortable. I'm chatting away with this guy. And finally, after about an hour and a half, he says, you know what? I think I'll hire you. And I was thinking, are you kidding me? And I said, okay, I'd love to work in what is now the Museum of American History. He said, oh, no. We only have a job in the Air and Space Museum. And I said, let me be clear. I'm a 19th century historian. I don't like airplanes. I really am not interested in space. And the secretary gave me that wonderful list. He gave me that, young man, how much money are you living on now? $309 a month. You become a historian at the Air and Space Museum, you make 5 times that. I said, I'm a historian at the Air and Space Museum. So in a way, that's how I got to where I was. But what I realized is that the greatest joy I had was straddling the worlds of the academy and the museum. To recognize that the museums, especially a place like the Smithsonian, gives you the biggest classroom you could ask to be able to engage the issues you care about. And also, it gives you a classroom that's unbelievably diverse in age, in ethnicity, in educational levels, so that really got me excited. And I realized that when the Smithsonian's at its best, it's creating conversations with people that go in directions you couldn't imagine. You could curate an exhibition in a certain way, and then you watch people who don't know each other engaging with an object or engaging with an exhibition, and suddenly they're asking questions you hadn't thought about, and they're taking the direction in ways you hadn't anticipated. To me, that's the great joy of being able to sort of give people a foundation of possibility, and then they can take it in amazing places. So for me, it's really been the opportunity of a lifetime to do something that I care about in a way that is accessible and made available to so many people.
And of course, you don't have to grade any papers.
Oh, let me tell you, you got a great staff. You got a great. I do miss grading blue books, though.
Oh, you do. Well, obviously, you've spent your career there. Where I first really started to follow you was the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I had the privilege of visiting it. I think it was 2016 that it opened, and it had just opened, and of course you couldn't get a ticket for love nor money, but I was at a conference in Washington and they said, oh, we're going to have our drinks reception at. And I was like, happy days. Can I ask, how many of you have actually visited that museum? Yeah. It is an incredible place, Lonnie, and obviously it finishes with Obama's election as president, but you were the vision behind that, and you made that happen, and there's always a team behind you, I get that. But could you tell us a little bit more about why you wanted to do that wider vision, and how you actually made it happen?
You know, I had left the Smithsonian to run the Chicago Historical Society and thought, that's it, I'm done. I'm going to be in Chicago the rest of my career. And when the Smithsonian asked and said, we're going to build this museum, are you interested? I immediately said no. This museum the idea had floated around for over 100 years. How did I believe I could do something that nobody else could do? So I was convinced that this was something beyond me. But as I listened to other people talk about the museum, I thought that they were talking about a museum for the 1950s, not for the 21st century. For me, the reason why I got excited about it, that I had this vision that said, the museum has to be a two-sided coin. One side is this really deep insider's perspective of African American culture that would allow you to cry as you ponder the pain of slavery or segregation. But also you'd find the joy that is in that community, the resiliency. And I heard people say that, but I realized that if you did that, you really fail as part of the Smithsonian. That what you wanted to do was to say, that's one side of the coin. But the other side of the coin was to say, this story of African Americans is the story of us all. It shapes profoundly who all Americans are. If you're interested in understanding American notions of spirituality, resiliency, or optimism, where better to look than this community? And if you want to look at the limits of the promise of America, where better to look than that community? And I never heard anybody saying that two-sided coin. So I thought, well, what the heck, let me give it a shot. And the reality was, I loved Chicago, but I was enamored with the Smithsonian. And to really recognize that, and I guess the way I framed it was, as you could imagine America, being African American, you're not running many cultural institutions. And so running a major museum in Chicago really nurtured my soul. But I realized that if I could come back and craft this museum the way I was envisioning it, it would nurture the soul of all our ancestors. And that was too powerful for me to turn down. So basically, I came back and was very fortunate because we began with a staff of one, besides me, no idea where the museum would be, no money raised, no collections. So the notion was, instead of saying, oh my God, that's a real problem, it really gave me an opportunity to think from a blank slate, to say, what could it be? How do you build alliances? How do you find money? So it really gave us time with a small staff that ultimately in that first year was probably about 6 or 7 people, to really think about how do we imagine a place that no one can yet imagine. And that was really very exciting. And, the story I always tell is that when I first came back, they gave me an office in a building away from the rest of the Smithsonian. And I went to that office and the door was locked. So I went down to the front desk and said, I'm the new director of this museum from the Smithsonian. I'd like to get into my office. They said, we don't know who you are. We're not letting you in. So I went down to security. I figured, let me go to security. So I went to security, knocked on the door, explained, I'm the new director of this great new museum. And security said to me, we don't know who you are, and we're not going to let you in because you might steal something. Now, it's an empty office. What am I going to steal? But I went back, and I'm standing in front of the door, and there was a maintenance guy came by, and he had a crowbar. So I took the crowbar and broke my way into my own office. And to me, that was really important because it told me nobody was ready for this museum. Not the Smithsonian, not the country, maybe even not me. And I have a replica of that crowbar because the guy wouldn't let me keep his crowbar. But I have a replica of that crowbar in my office to remind me of the challenge of doing something that nobody believed you can do, and to find a way to believe that you could make a way out of no way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just an incredible story, but it required a vision, but it also required money. I can't remember what the figure is now, Lonnie, but it was a very considerable fundraising enterprise for you that took time. Do you want to just share some of that journey as well?
Well, we had to raise, $500 million from the private sector and then convince Congress to give another $300 million. So it was a huge endeavor. But part of what made it work was, first of all, recognizing that it's going to take years. And that in essence, I took 450 fundraising trips over an 8-year period, trying to build relationships, asking for money. But there were 2 things that made this work. One was the vision that this was the story of us all. So suddenly there were corporations who said, I want to be part of this. And normally in the States, if you fundraise, 17% of your money comes from corporations. We were able to get 50% of our money from corporations because they saw it as something that was broader than one community. And then the other thing we did was I created a membership program to say for $50 or $100, you get a card and you can be a member. Well, the Smithsonian thought that was the dumbest idea ever, that it was going to be 10 years before the museum opened and the museum's free. Why would you want that? Well, I never forgot, early in my career, I was collecting in a house in California, and this woman had a picture. She said, you can have the picture, but you can't have what was in the frame. What was in the frame was her father's membership card to a civil rights organization from 1913. And I never forgot how proud she was to have that card. And so that's what we did. We created a sense not to raise money, but to give people a sense of ownership. And ultimately became the most successful membership program of the Smithsonian. And that not only helped us raise money, but what I did is I then took the millions of people who became members and I broke their membership out via congressional district. So every time I went to the Hill, I could say, there are 2,000 people in your district that care about this museum. And that's how we were able to get some of the resources from Congress. But there's no doubt it was really about having good people who knew how to work the system, who prepared me well, and had recognized that it was just going to be a long journey.
Yeah.
And 400 and some trips was a long journey.
A long journey. I mean, and talk about a model. People in the room I know care about fundraising, but that just puts us all in the Halfpenny place. That's incredible. I'd like us to think a little bit about impact, if that's all right. Now, personally, I hate that word impact, but how the museum has been transformational. In the context of the United States, where obviously it's a very challenging moment and you're touching on issues that are extremely raw, and then maybe to think about it internationally as well. But first, maybe in the context of the US, where do you feel that it's made its biggest impact?
Well, on the one hand, for those of you that know Washington, it's on the National Mall. And that's the space between the White House, the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, where other Smithsonian museums are. But it really is the place where the world comes to understand what it means to be an American. And my notion was that there were great museums, but they were incomplete. There were holes in our knowledge and our understanding. And I felt it was crucially important to have that museum on the mall, because one of the joys of the Smithsonian is people will wrestle with Smithsonian museum subjects, natural history or Asian art, that they won't in their own community because they're coming to do the Smithsonian. So I felt that it was really an opportunity to sort of centralize African American culture in the American experience. And what has happened is that from the day it opened, it changed the way people thought about African American culture. That museums around the country began to do more. There was this sense of conversation around it, and it didn't hurt that Barack Obama cut the ribbon. And so there was this great excitement. But what it also means, candidly, is my belief was that once that museum opened, as long as there was an America, that story would be there to be told. Now, no one knew how 8 years later we'd be in such a partisan time, but it really means that the museum is even more important.
Right.
That it's this symbol, but more importantly, it's a place to go where millions and millions and millions of people have gone and will now tell that story. What I think is unbelievably humbling is both the way the public responds to it in the United States. I mean, I go places and people want their picture with me. I'm like, with me? What, are you kidding me? And there's this great sense of excitement. But the other thing that is even more humbling is its impact globally. Yeah. That I think the notion has been that I have heard from numerous countries. You know, I was just in Portugal and the Netherlands, and the notion is if you could tell that kind of a story in America, we could tell that story or a comparable story here. And I think that this notion of saying that it is challenging but doable to illuminate all the dark corners of a people's experience, but to do it in a way that is less about pointing guilt and more about finding understanding, healing, and reconciliation. I think it's really been a kind of beacon globally that people are really seizing on. And so I think in many ways, what I love about it is that it gives me a platform to not talk about race. That's not what the platform is about. It's a platform to talk about possibility, to platform to imagine a world that we can't imagine yet. And to me, it really is the opportunity to say, how is a cultural institution, I don't care where it is, how is it transformative? How does it bring people together? How does it give people clarity and understanding? So for me, when I used to tell the staff what we were doing, I'd say, we're not building a museum. I don't want to hear about building a museum. What we're building is an institution that matters, an institution of value, an institution that can be transformative. And that's what sort of the staff was so good about implementing and making my dream real.
Oh, absolutely. And in terms of that global impact, we were chatting earlier and you talked a little bit about Cape Town and your relationship with South Africa. And that's particularly important to us here in the Hub because and recently Ireland has developed this Charlotte Makeke, Mary Robinson Mobility Chair, very much modelled on the Sao Paulo Yates Chair. And I think that's been such an exciting development, and obviously Eve and the Hub have been absolutely central to that. So tell us a little bit about what you've been doing in South Africa, because I think that it's fascinating as well.
Well, I think that I'm a historian of America, trained in America, but doing so much work overseas has changed me. It's allowed me to think things differently, and South Africa is really important in my own evolution. I first went to South Africa in 88 or 89 before the fall of apartheid, and really began to see a nation that I expected to implode violently. And over the years, I began to realize that part of what kept that nation together was culture, was history, the power of that. And so probably for every summer for 8 or 9 years, I taught on Robben Island and taught many of the people that are running the museums now about culture and history. And for me, South Africa changed the way, it almost made me believe in history in a way I thought I never did. And it gave me a sense that it taught me that history is as much about today and tomorrow as it is about yesterday. And that sort of shaped the way I thought about everything. Plus, South Africa, I'll tell you, so when I first, in those days, it took forever to fly to South Africa, flew to Joburg, and African Americans or Black people couldn't stay in the hotels. So they put me up on the college campus. I didn't know that's why they put me on the college campus. So we're on this empty campus with 2 other African Americans, and we're starving. We'd flown all day. So I'm trying to find a place to eat, and there was an Italian restaurant, and it had the gate closed, the iron door. And when I knocked on it, the guy waved us away. Now, I grew up in a Sicilian town, so I cursed him out in Sicilian. He immediately started laughing, opened the door, and fed us. And so I thought to myself, it's a good thing you know how to curse in Italian. But I think that for me, sort of South Africa profoundly continues to shape the work I did. One of the most recent examples was I wanted to spend a lot of time trying to find the remnants of a slave ship. I went around the country, around the world, negotiated in Cuba, on a variety of places, when one of my former colleagues in South Africa said, we think we might have a slave ship, but we're not sure. Could you bring your expertise? Ultimately, because of those connections, we found the remnants of a slave ship, the São José, that had left Lisbon in 1794, went to pick up 514 people from the Makua tribe in Mozambique, sank on its way back to the New World. So when we found out and did all the research, I then went to Mozambique and met with the Makua people. And the chief of the Makua people gave me this vessel that was wrapped in cowrie shells. And he said, this is a gift. And I opened it and it was full of soil. And I was trying to figure out what kind of gift it is. And then he said to me, I need you to do something for my ancestors, that they have asked that you take this soil and sprinkle it back on the site of the wreck so that for the first time since 1794, my people can sleep in their own land. And to me, that's when I realized this was not about a museum. This was not about a journey. This is about, being able to sort of make the connection between the past and the present in a way that could be transformative. So to me, South Africa has always been crucially important to everything I've done.
And what an incredibly moving story as well. It makes the hairs stand up on the back of your neck. Can I keep us thinking about the relationship between the past and the present? So here in Ireland, we're really just beginning to get our heads around repatriation, restitution. Here in Trinity, we have a colonial legacies project, and indeed some of my colleagues who are leading that project are here this evening. And we're just at the beginning of a journey. And I think people are approaching it with a remarkably, in a very positive way, a very non-judgmental way. It's about understanding the past, not about judging. Given your wealth of experience in America and globally, what lessons have we to learn from what has gone well in your experience, but equally the pitfalls that we need to be avoiding?
I mean, I think there's so many things that I've learned over the last even decade. I think one of the things is, even though I knew it as a historian, the notion of the pendulum swing. In 2016, we really thought that we had changed the way America thought about history, thought about African American culture, thought about its own future. And to suddenly realize that, basically 6 weeks after the museum opened, we had a different president. Donald Trump became president. And so, I had to realize, okay, how do I sort of use history in this contested time? And I think so it first reminded me that you've got to be able to articulate clearly why it is you're doing this, why these issues are so important, and why they're important not just to academics, why they're important to the broader community. And that's something I find myself having to do with monotonous regularity, because it's the right thing to do. I mean, in some ways, it's a challenge of historians. We talk a lot about why history matters to each other, but not necessarily to the public. And I think that's really the sort of challenge and the joy. I think the other issue is really recognizing that to grapple with these questions, we have to help the public embrace ambiguity, embrace complexity, because the public often wants simple answers to complex questions. And I think the challenge we have is to say, this is not about simple answers. It's about ambiguity. It's about the challenge. It's about a phrase that I've heard a lot here, that we have shared history but not shared memories, and to be really clear about what that means. And I think the other piece that sort of we've learned a lot of is that you've got to get outside of where you are and build your allies. That it was crucially important to think about who are either university partners or other museum partners around the country that allowed you to sort of hear things through different lenses, to build alliances, and candidly, from where I sit, give me political cover, right? To be able to say that you've got that support. So in many ways, those are some of the sort of challenges. And I wish I could tell you I've got the answers, because I'm very worried about the strong partisanship in the United States right now, and worried about the kind of fear of being able to explore these questions. We spend a lot of time at the Smithsonian giving educators cover to say that, the Smithsonian believes these issues are important, and we want you to be able to use the umbrella of the Smithsonian to deal with it in, Illinois or North Dakota or Rhode Island. But there's a limit to how strong the umbrella is, and we're trying to figure out what that really means going forward.
And just looking towards the future, how are you feeling about it? Obviously, we're all anxious, not just by what's going on in the United States, but look at India, look at what's happening in Europe, our nearest neighbors. Lots of issues.
So, I guess the question I ought to give back to you is, when they kick me out, will you hire me?
Yes.
I think that I would argue that coming out of an African American experience, being a historian of African America, the one thing you realize is you have to be hopeful. That you have to realize that it is a perpetual and eternal struggle. And that I think part of the challenge is people saying, we've gotten to the promised land. We've got new civil rights legislation, or you had a black president. And what you realize is you've gotten to a plateau. And that you've got to work on this forever. And I think so, recognizing that this is not a project, but it's really a way of being and a way of living. If you're going to make the kind of changes you want, is really, I think, one of the great challenges.
I'm conscious that time is moving on. I could have had another few questions for you, Lonnie, but again, then we'll hand it over to colleagues for your questions. But I'd like to bring you now, if I may, to your visit to Ireland and your Irishness. Obviously, Ireland, as Eve alluded to, was both, if you want, colonised, but coloniser. And we have this very complicated relationship with colonialism, with empire. We see this, although sometimes we're reluctant to acknowledge it, but it's the reality. And I'm just a little, I don't mean to be asking you too many personal questions, but I'd love you to share, if you wouldn't mind, some of your Irishness and your Irish connections.
It's interesting. I think that, traditionally African Americans know so little about their history that in the United States you can get back to 1870 through a census and that's it. Obviously, DNA changes everything. And so my DNA is 18% Irish. You can tell by the red hair, right? But I think that what's interesting is what that really means.
Right.
But on the one hand, there is this amazing sense of trying to understand the totality of what got you here, who you are. But it also means that, many people say, oh, you've got Irish ancestry. Well, more than likely it wasn't consensual. They weren't married. It's really about power relationships. And so how do you feel about that? And also I think it's interesting because what's been wonderful here has been the welcome sense that we've gotten throughout wherever we've been. But that's not always the case between African Americans and Irish in the United States. And so it's just kind of interesting trying to balance that out in my own mind. What's been funny is that I guess what is the family is Doherty? Doherty. So suddenly I'm all over. There are more cousins that are calling me. I'm your cousin from. Thank you.
Well, you've got a castle. Tell them that.
Yeah, but it's in ruin. How come my timing is bad? I get a castle in ruin. But I think that part of it is really the notion of struggling to understand what made you who you are. And DNA is both this amazing light, but it also is confusing, troubling, and challenging. And I think so sort of my Irishness is just that. Fascinating, problematic. When I remember telling my mother that I was 18% Irish, she said, "Prove it." Well, I got the DNA.
Well, as a person with strong Donegal links, I'm delighted it's Doherty. I'm delighted it's an issue. And so if you're going to be any part of Ireland, at least it's the right part of Ireland. And I realise I've just offended many people in the room. So apologies. But it does take us to this complicated relationship, and again, Kieran Madden, I think Miriam Nyans here from NYU, that fantastic Brown, Green and Black Voices project, and I think this is such an important area, as you say, that science is really allowing us to discover the numbers, and they're very considerable. I forget the figure, but many are coming from a very dark place, and it's being open about that and acknowledging that, as well as hopefully enjoying your Irishness, because it brings us to the trip. This is your first trip to Ireland, and you've been very busy in the north and obviously down in Dublin the last couple of days. But tell us, what do you, you'll forgive us the weather, Lonnie, but weather aside.
If this is the worst it is, I'm fine.
Oh, all right, well that's good. So how have you found your time here the last couple of days?
I think it's sort of, anytime you go someplace for the first time, it's a sense of discovery. It's a discovery of the culture by the people you engage. It's a sense of discovery of, candidly, the political tensions that are strong in Northern Ireland and Ireland. It's also been this amazing opportunity to sort of see this place that I've always heard about. Now, I will tell you something that's really dumb. Okay, in kindergarten, when I'm 5 years old, the first song we were taught was Molly Malone. The very first song. So Mary Pat Kelly told me there's a Molly Malone statue.
Yeah.
2 days before I leave, I actually see somebody that was in kindergarten with me that I haven't seen in 50 years. And I said, I'm going to Ireland, and she starts singing Molly Malone. So while there were many things that I had to see, I had to go see Molly Malone. So that was today. Me and Molly.
And the Book of Kells.
Yes, the Book of Kells. Yeah, Book of Kells, Mario.
But you've enjoyed it, and obviously your visit's not over, and tomorrow will be, I think, some Irish music and culture, so by the time you leave, you'll have had a good sense of the country, I hope.
Well, I think that the challenge I've always felt is that when I go someplace and it becomes part of me, like this is becoming part of me, I'll show up again.
That's great to hear.